Hello and welcome to the Your Financial Pharmacist Real Estate Investing Podcast, a show all about empowering pharmacists to achieve financial freedom through real estate investing. I'm Nate Hedrick, and each week, my co-host David Bright and I explore stories from pharmacists all over the country who are achieving their real estate goals while maintaining a meaningful career in pharmacy. Whether you're a first-time investor or a seasoned pro, we're here to provide education and inspiration about the world of real estate. Please note, this podcast is intended for educational purposes only and should not be considered financial or investment advice. Hey, David, how's it going?
Hey, good, thanks. How you doing, man?
Good. It is holiday season officially. I should have my eggnog next to us. This is our official holiday episode, and excited to kick back, spend some time with friends and family over here. And it's just a great time to focus on everything that's really important and why we do all this crazy real estate stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. This is great time for that, kind of end of year / beginning of year reflection, right?
Mm-hmm.
Paired with time with family and friends, and it's great for refocusing. And I know there's obviously a lot of pharmacists and other healthcare workers right now that are hard at work over the holidays, and we certainly appreciate that as well.
Oh, 100%. Please. For all the real pharmacists out there, those that are in actual spaces, helping patients every single day, thank you guys for all the work that you do. Again, as we look back at the show and over the last year and beyond that, we really saw a lot of guests coming in that wanted to leverage real estate and real estate investing really to help them spend more time with people they care about, with family, with friends. And they had a few resources in common that helped them along that journey.
Yeah, we didn't do a real formal or thorough accounting of the resources that were mentioned, but Rich Dad, Poor Dad was a resource that was super often recommended and has been routinely mentioned for developing mindset and achieving that freedom and flexibility that many pharmacists seem to be looking for. And that freedom and flexibility might be, for some people, that might be a little extra cushion in the monthly budget to, pay for a lawn service or cover an extra vacation each year to just, do something different with time. Or it might look like retiring a few years earlier or 100 other things, right? Different pharmacists tend to find that this looks different when it comes to that concept of freedom, and certainly think that a lot of pharmacists, though, appreciate that concept of freedom.
Yeah, and it's just so interesting that book is the one that really did the inspiration. And so many people mention that, right? It was the inspiration for myself and just countless others that we've spoken with. And so we thought for this holiday season, as we're looking back, appreciating things that are, again, meaningful to our lives and have been changing, moments of change in our life, that is, we thought it'd be a great time to do a deep dive on some of the more memorable tidbits from Rich Dad, Poor Dad. And again, just why that was the thing that got so many people in the door with real estate investing.
Yeah. So like we often say, every few episodes, we do that deeper dive into a topic that a guest has brought up, or in this case, what many guests have brought up is that resource that got so many real estate investors started. I know we were talking right before we hit record about how we both got this on like Audible or Kindle or, books, and we've given this one away to people and all that just because it's such a meaningful book.
And in fact, since you mentioned it, David, we are doing another giveaway, right? In the true spirit of the holiday season, we're going to be doing a book giveaway. 3 lucky winners going to receive their own copy of Rich Dad, Poor Dad. So those of you that are out there who have not read it, this is a fantastic time to get it for free. We will send it to you guys. Basically, all you need to do to enter, if you're interested in this, go to yfprealestate.com. That's our website where you can find David and myself. And there's a button on that that says download the real estate investing guide or the REI guide. If you download that guide now, basically until January 9th, you're eligible to receive that potential win, right? 3 people are going to be randomly selected at the end of that period, and we'll go ahead and ship that book off to you guys. So head on over to yfprealestate.com, download the REI guide, and you'll be entered to win. So again, if you've not read this book before, fantastic opportunity to get access to it for free.
Yeah. And if you have read it before, like, don't just stop the podcast, right? There's so much good in there that's worth a good refresher, right?
Definitely.
This is one of those books that, I've read multiple times, and I know that the lessons in the book kind of hit differently through different seasons of investing. So not only might it be a good reread for you, but it can be a great book if you are the winner and you've read it before, another great book to give away to someone else.
Yeah. Great point, David. I appreciate that. So you and I got a chance to put a list together right before we hit record. We wanted to make sure that we were really pumping this book up and talking about the important aspects of it. And so we wanted to start off with, I think, one of the most challenge heavy things that Robert leads off with, which is the definition or the concept of an asset and how Robert defines that. And so let's start there.
Yeah, I feel like this might have been like the most mind-blowing concept to me when I first opened the book, because I had only understood the very traditional definition of an asset.
Hmm.
And I thought that that was the only smart way to buy assets then, was to save up and pay cash for assets. And so what flipped for me was when Kiyosaki's concept that an asset is something that puts money in your pocket and a liability is something that costs you money. So, and at this point, when I had read this book, essentially the biggest asset that I had in the traditional sense of an asset was the house that my wife and I lived in. But in this situation, it shocked me to learn that I essentially had no assets. My house wasn't an asset. My car wasn't an asset. I had no assets when I read this book. And that was just kind of a shocking thing for me.
Yeah, that was a tough concept for me as well because I had grown up thinking that, oh, once you get a house, that's your first asset and then you're
Mhm.
off and running, right? And that's exactly where I was. I had a house and a ton of student loan debt, and that was it. I had nothing. I mean, again, by his definitions, I had no assets at all. And I think many pharmacists work hard to get their degree, to get a good job, start their financial journey, thinking they're doing really well, that they have built up these assets, when in Robert Kiyosaki's definition, that's not the case. And so I think even something as simple as like buying a car, or, all of those pieces that we think of as an asset, he really challenges that. And so I think that was important for me, especially at the time that I read this book. And I thought, how could it be that all this hard work that I'm doing is not turning into actual appreciable assets by his definition?
Yeah. And I think one of the things that comes out loud and clear in the book is that Kiyosaki is very big into real estate investing, and that being different from owning a personal residence. And so we've certainly had people that have been on both sides of that fence simultaneously. Like we recently just had Corey Sanders back on episode 85 talking about that hybrid model of house hacking, where you are living in the house that is also your investment. So it is an asset. It's not, but otherwise, ordinarily an asset, according to Kiyosaki, is a piece of real estate in this example that puts money in your pocket.
Yeah. And we talk with a lot of individuals on this podcast about single family homes. I think that's the one that
Mhm.
jumps to everyone's forefront of their mind because it feels like a more achievable goal, especially when you compare that to something like an enormous apartment complex or a commercial strip mall, right? Those just seem a little further out of reach, even though we've talked to many pharmacists that have done exactly that. But most pharmacists, I think, are going to start off with residential investing, single family homes, maybe small multifamily, 4 or fewer units. And that's a much more achievable investment for many people. In a lot of cases, that investment can produce cash flow. And all of a sudden, you are talking about an asset, and you've really turned that corner just like that.
Yeah. And one of the reasons why we both enjoy real estate investing is that real estate offers more than just cash flow, right?
Hmm.
By this definition, cash flow really matters, but real estate additionally creates potential returns through the long-term appreciation, through the tax advantages, and through the debt pay down by the rent proceeds. And then cash flow is that fourth piece. Obviously, in an ideal situation, there's going to be a significant cash flow coming from that real estate investment as well. So even if you don't count on mortgage pay down or tax benefits or appreciation, the fact that an intentionally purchased real estate may produce cash flow means that it's an asset according to this definition.
And I think, again, you don't have to take everything that Kiyosaki says at face value, right? If you take a step back and think about cash flow for a second, it makes a lot of sense for a variety of reasons. We've talked many times about how pharmacists tend to be risk averse or safety oriented. And even though we define cash flow not just as the rent minus the mortgage, but the rent minus the mortgage and any other expenses associated with that property, having cash flow means that if things go at the back end of the plan, like if they go really bad, there's at least a better chance that you won't have to pay extra expenses associated with that property, right? If it doesn't all work out exactly the way that you've planned for or that you've budgeted for, you still have some wiggle room in there because that cash flow is protective. It creates this safety net, so to speak.
Right. And I know that was definitely one of my early fears. In buying that very first property, I was worried that if there's big expenses, what am I going to do? Or what if the tenant doesn't pay? What am I going to do? Well, I have to reach into my pocket and take care of those bills. And inevitably, not only is that a possibility, but that will happen at some point. Houses have expenses associated with them. Whether it's your house that you live in personally, there will be expenses. There will be expenses in rental property. At some point, there will not be a paying tenant in that property. Maybe it's because it's a transition between tenants, or a tenant just misses rent that month. Like if you own real estate long enough, those things will happen. So for me, the first rental property that we had operated with rent that was more than double the mortgage payment. And that was a great first step because that gave me a tremendous amount of security that I could fill up an emergency fund. And then when expenses came up, I would be prepared for those and I could handle those. And that's one of the many values of the cash flow piece of the rental property investing.
Yeah, and if you take it a step further, right? If that cash flow is actually going into your pocket and you've covered all your expenses like you're supposed to, and it really is true cash flow that's coming back to you, now all of a sudden that cash flow can produce and purchase other assets, and so your assets are then paying you to purchase more assets and to start really truly accumulating wealth. And I think that's where the shift really starts to happen.
Yeah, and that was really powerful for us when we saw that, that first house that we bought created an additional monthly payment, right?
Mm-hmm.
And if you've been through the mortgage process or you've learned about that at all, you've heard about that debt to income ratio that's really critical. How much debt do you have versus how much income do you have? And as you add mortgage payments, that's going to worsen that. And the second rental property did the same, but pretty quickly we were able to start then counting the income off of those properties because we got them tenanted. The tenants were paying rent. We could demonstrate that rent, and then suddenly the income's going up. And so that makes it easier then to buy additional properties, not just because of these metrics, but because that cash flow is coming in, and that helps you to save up and buy again and save up and buy again. And absolutely, it kind of pushes in that direction.
Yeah, and that really brings us to kind of our second point. And one of the things that I think is very difficult to get your head around the first time through Rich Dad Poor Dad, and that is that the power of that debt has to buy assets. I think we grow up with this idea of, at least I did, right? Of you don't want to be in debt. All debt is bad and it doesn't serve you. You just have to get out of it as fast as possible. But what Kiyosaki really puts out there is that you can use debt to acquire assets, and then that can benefit you down the road.
Yeah. And I think that there's a key distinction in how Kiyosaki defines debt, right? So there's good debt and bad debt in his definition. And so good debt is debt that puts money in your pocket. Bad debt is debt that takes money out of your pocket. So very related to that definition of an asset. An asset is something that puts money in your pocket. So good debt is debt that puts money in your pocket. So in this case, each of the rental properties that we bought were properties with a mortgage, which, Nate, I'm the same as you. Like, that was a really hard jumping off point of, because my wife and I had this very serious debt-free plan. We wanted to pay off student loans. We wanted to pay off our cars, and we wanted to get all this stuff paid off. And we wanted to get to that point where we could pay cash for a rental property.
Mm-hmm.
But at the time, looking back, it felt like it was going to take us like 100 years to that point. So we just dove in with a mortgage as our way to get started with rental property investing.
Yeah, and again, if you buy into what Kiyosaki is saying, that's a good thing, right? That debt that you took on for the rental property, while it's technically required monthly payment, the rent is substantially more than that. It's handling the monthly payment, it's handling your expenses, and the net effect of that debt was allowing that purchase to happen way sooner than you could have possibly done it alone, right? You're using other people's money, in this case, the bank, to make that asset purchase earlier than you could have done it had you just tried to buy all cash, like you mentioned.
Yeah. And again, that took a minute for us, right? Because we had such a hatred for debt, my wife and I, but we slowly came to more and more of this kind of Robert Kiyosaki mindset, thinking that, more and more comfortable with good debt as a way to put money in our pocket and to grow that kind of financial experience.
And I'll tell you, when we purchased our first rental property, we were still significantly in student loan debt, right? We had all of our credit card debt, all of our car debt, like all that was under control. The really, really bad debt had been kind of taken care of, but we were ready to pull the trigger on our first investment property, and we still had a bunch of student loan debt. And it was a really hard decision for us to make, to say, okay, here's $30,000 or whatever cash we had that we're going to throw at this thing. We could be putting that on our loans, and yeah, it wouldn't totally knock them out, but it'd be this nice big chunk, and we're really working toward being debt free and blah, blah, blah. But instead, we decided to go for the rental property. And I think a lot of people struggle with that decision of, I need to do this first, get onto this debt first before I can move on. But I'll tell you, for us, at least personally, again, we really tried to think through this decision with our financial planner and our accountant and everybody else. And we've used that rental property, that $30,000 that we spent to purchase that first as the down payment for that first property, that was used 5 times over by this point to pay down other debts, because we were able to use that single investment property to springboard everything else. So for us, again, and this is not for everybody, and I'm not advocating this is the way you have to go, but for us, when we looked at that, we said we can leverage this money now to benefit ourselves infinitely down the road rather than just doing a one-time $30,000 down payment and that's it. So it was, again, for us, we looked at that debt as an advantage to helping us get rid of our other bad debt.
Yeah, and there's a lot of nuance there, right? And a lot of intentionality that I think is worth pointing out. Like the conversations you had with your financial planner and accountant to make sure that that math worked, because yeah, that's a stressful thing for a lot of people that hear like get out of debt as fast as you can before you do anything else. And yeah, that's there are other perspectives on that plan, and this book really challenges that. So there's a lot in this book. Again, I feel like we could go on for hours about all kinds of points in this, but we've talked about the definition of an asset. We've talked about the power of debt to buy assets. And so the third, and we said we would keep this short, right? The final key point that we wanted to highlight is something that I've heard you bring up several times in the podcast, the shift in thinking from I can't afford it to how can I afford it?
Yeah, I can't tell you how monumental that was for me. And it's something I even carry with me to like my kids, right? So if we're at the store and my daughter wants something, right? A squishmallow
Mm-hmm.
that's popular right now for
Mm-hmm.
parents out there.
Oh yeah.
You know, dude, you have two
Oh
girls like I
yeah.
do. So you know. So
Yep.
they want a squishmallow, right? Rather than saying, well, we can't afford that, right? Or it's not something we have money for, the response becomes like, well, how could we budget for that? Or how could we afford that, right? And what are some things that we'd have to get rid of for us to be able to achieve that, right? And that mindset shift is something we're not taught, right? Or not many of us are taught anyway. And it was another concept that this book brought out that I had a hard time grasping at first, but once I locked in, man, it opened up so many possibilities for everything else.
Yeah, and I know that, you know, the rental property side of things feels to a lot of people like a much more impossible how. Like that's such a big jump in terms of like we struggled just to buy our own house, let alone buy a house that would be an investment. But that concept from if to how really is powerful because it puts you on that path of thinking that way. And so when it came to that if to how,
Mm.
like for us, one of the ways that we solved that for that first property was, well, you know, it's 20, 25%, maybe even more down. Like you mentioned, to go buy another house, you had to save up $30,000, which is no easy task,
Mm-hmm.
right? But buying a personal residence has a lot less of a down payment. And so we found that we could jump into a new primary residence and keep our former house as a rental. And that was a much smaller down payment, a much smaller saving. So by just kind of trying to get creative with how could we do that without having an enormous pile of cash sitting there, we were able to figure out, well, okay, we can put 3.5% or 5% down on another house, move into that, retain a prior property as a rental. So those if then how, and then to get to the next house, you know, well, like that's another chunk of change to save up. What else could we do? Maybe for us that turned into, well, could we flip a house? And could we take the profit from house flipping to be the down payment on the next rental, which created a whole nother can of worms of, I don't know how to flip a house, but how can we flip a house? And so, yeah, that if turning into how is just a big mindset push to open a lot of doors.
The big one that comes to mind for me is all the pharmacists that we've spoken with, all the clients that I've worked with over the years that make that shift when they say, I want to buy a property, but I have $10,000 a month in student loan debt or whatever, right? I've got tons of student loan debt. I can't afford it. I can't afford a house. I can't afford an investment property. I can't get into the game. Think of all the excuses that people put out there, right? But there are a subset of people that we've spoken with, that I've worked with, that instead of saying, I can't afford that, they go out and they say, well, if instead I use the low money down program available as a pharmacist or available through the FHA, and I buy this property with $5,000 down or whatever, now all of a sudden I can get a tenant in there, right? I can buy a duplex. I can rent out half of it. I can live in the other half, or I can rent by the room and I can live in one of the rooms. Or, I mean, think of all the stories and all the people that we've talked to this past year, and all the people that have said, well, on paper, I can't afford this, but I found a way to afford it. And it's actually benefiting me and others along the way. And those are the ones that I think are really the ones that have unlocked that step that Kiyosaki describes.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that as we share these stories, that can still sound kind of overwhelming because a house is oftentimes, like a person's primary residence is oftentimes one of the largest purchases that they will make, right? So I want to zoom out for a minute and say that, you know, these stretching and learning experiences don't all come at once, right? And I don't want that to feel super intimidating, but every year in my role as a pharmacy professor, right, I see pharmacy students come up that are so intimidated by those initial disease states. And like they see a bunch of hypertension medications and it's so stressful. And then at the end of the year, they look back and they're like, wait, why was I stressed out about hypertension medications? Like that's so easy now as they get further on. And so the stepwise, just kind of slow build of investing and putting one foot in front of another and learning and just thinking from that if to how, like, how could this be done? And what could I do? And building that plan, like that really is a lot more achievable, particularly if you talk with pharmacists that have done this once or twice, so much more achievable than it looks like from that position of before the first investment.
I think that's super important. It's kind of why we do this, right? Why we put up this podcast, why we have the community that we have. It's because it's helping people who have not done a thing to connect with people who have done a thing so they can get further on, right? And that might be buying your first property. It might be buying your 10th. It might be buying your first apartment. It might be leaving your job or going down to 20 hours a week or, starting your own pharmacy, whatever that looks like. There are people in this community that have done the thing that you want to do. And now you've got a chance to connect with them, right? And that's kind of why we do this. And it's why I think books like Rich Dad Poor Dad are so powerful, because you're learning from somebody who actually did it rather than just somebody who has an idea and then writing it down on paper. So I think super important to look at things like this book. There's a reason it's inspired so many people in our community and why it's brought up so often. We summarized 3 main points here, but there are obviously many, many more nuggets within that book. We really encourage you to read it if you haven't already. Those 3 main points, though, that we talked about today, start off with the concept of an asset. Redefine that if you don't already define it the way that Robert Kiyosaki describes. 2 was the power of debt and the ability that it has to buy assets for you. And then finally, the shift in thinking from I can't afford something to how can I afford something. Really important mindset shift and something that, again, has changed the way that I approach purchases in my life.
Yeah. And there's obviously so much more in that book. We had a 4 and a 5 on a list for a minute of, learning and managing emotions with money or controlling spending, but we just decided let's keep it at those 3. We found like those were 3 key concepts that would be broadly applicable and strong foundation for then other points, jumping off from that definition of an asset, definition of debt, and going from I can't afford it to how can I afford it?
Yeah. Well, if you are thinking about how you can afford this book, you may not have to, right? We have the book giveaway that I mentioned at the top of the episode. I want to hit it again really quickly. We are giving away 3 copies of Rich Dad Poor Dad to the YFP real estate investing community. If you are interested in joining this giveaway, head on over to yfprealestate.com. That's www.yfprealestate.com. Download the real estate investing guide. And if you do that, you're automatically entered to win. You have until now, from now, when you hear this episode, until January 9th, 2023, to enter, and 3 winners will be randomly selected. So really encourage you to check that out. Appreciate you joining David and myself for this little holiday episode. Hopefully some of you found Rich Dad Poor Dad under the tree this year, or if not, you'll be maybe one of our lucky winners here on the giveaway. So thanks for joining us, guys, and have a happy holiday.
Thanks for listening to the YFP Real Estate Investing Podcast. If you like what you heard on today's show, please leave us a review and subscribe to the show so you never miss an episode. If you have a question, know someone that would make a good guest, or want to connect with Nate or David, head on over to yfprealestate.com and join the growing YFP Real Estate Investing Facebook group. As we conclude this week's episode of the YFP Real Estate Investing Podcast, an important reminder that the content in this podcast is provided to you for your informational purposes only and is not intended to provide and should not be relied on for investment or any other advice. Information in the podcast and corresponding materials should not be construed as a solicitation or offer to buy or sell any investment or related financial products. We urge listeners to consult with a financial advisor with respect to any investment. Furthermore, the information contained in our archived newsletters, blog posts, and podcasts is not updated and may not be accurate at the time you listen to it on this podcast. Opinions and analyses expressed herein are solely those of your financial pharmacist, unless otherwise noted, and constitute judgments as of the dates published. Such information may contain forward-looking statements which are not intended to be guarantees of future events. Actual results could differ materially from those anticipated in the forward-looking statements. For more information, please visit yourfinancialpharmacist.com/disclaimer. Thank you for your support of the YFP Real Estate Investing Podcast. Have a great rest of your week.